Mr. Peter Hitchens argues that the much-lauded Anglo-American alliance is in fact based on tactfully concealed hostility.
Every afternoon at 4:30 at RAF Mildenhall, they play the two national anthems of the United States and Britain, summing up the strange state of this strange place. I'm standing here more than 100 feet above RAF Mildenhall on the control tower, looking out towards the towers of Ely Cathedral over miles of English countryside. But directly beneath my feet, an American Air Force base, American law, guarded by American guards with M16s, American servicemen, a small piece of America in the middle of England.
Oh, Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni.
So ran the song British redcoats sang during the American War of Independence, to mock the ragamuffin appearance of the American colonists. Later, those same redcoats were marched into captivity by the very men they'd sneered at. And from that colossal reverse has grown one of the most misunderstood connections between two nations. I'm Peter Hitchens, and this is an unsentimental examination of what we like to call the special relationship. Is it? Special? Certainly. Friendly? Not exactly. Conventional wisdom states that Britain and America are closer than any other two nations, and this closeness has saved us from annihilation.
If we hadn't had that alliance, there wouldn't have been the victory in the First World War, probably, and there certainly wouldn't have been the victory in the Second World War, there wouldn't have been the victory in the Cold War. So if we hadn't had that alliance of a declining power and a rising power, there'd have been a real problem.
Jonathan Powell, former Chief of Staff to that unflagging invoker of the special relationship, Tony Blair. Winston Churchill invented the phrase to describe the spirit of the age. The world's two greatest English-speaking free nations, united first against Hitler and then against communism. Professor Kathleen Burke of University College London explains.
The bureaucracies working together are very important. The two navies have interchangeable parts. The Foreign Office and the State Department exchange each other's personnel. They read each other's dispatches sometimes. A feeling you have someone to talk to, a feeling that if you're out in Lagos and you're the second secretary of the American Embassy and you want to know what's going on, you hear the shots fired down the street, you ring up the second secretary of the British Embassy. So the exchange of information, the fundamental trust.
My brother, for example, Charles Powell, who was Mrs. Thatcher's foreign policy advisor, was able to talk to Colin Powell in a very friendly way. Colin Powell even claimed to be his cousin. And it's very important to have that kind of intimate, cosy relationship where you can call up and ask for help.
But is that relationship, based on shared language, culture and history, really so cosy? The American National Anthem. A thrilling song of national pride, played at every baseball park, shopping mall, and, of course, 4th of July parade. Based on Francis Scott Key's hymn. But listen carefully to this verse.
Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge.
Whose foul footsteps might those be? Why, ours, of course. A reference to the Royal Navy's failed 25-hour bombardment of Baltimore in 1814.
And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free.
America's national song is, in fact, an anti-British outburst. The idea of a cosy friendship between the two nations is fiercely contradicted by a long and spiky history of countless territorial, naval, economic and diplomatic clashes, and plenty of raw, popular American hostility to the British Empire. By the start of the 20th century, America was herself an empire, increasingly willing to supplant Britain as the world's greatest nation. Even the two world wars in which the US and Britain fought on the same side hid a deep struggle for supremacy, above all on the high seas. In the early 20th century, Britain had the world's most powerful navy, but America challenged it, sending the majestic Great White Fleet around the world. While Britain worried about German naval power, it was the officially friendly United States Navy that was destined to supplant the British White Ensign with the Star-Spangled Banner. Military historian Corelli Barnett.
The whole question of American naval aspirations was directed against us. as much as against, say, the Japanese. It was a lot of warships, particularly capital ships, to make ocean-going fleets, both a Pacific fleet and an Atlantic fleet, and therefore it was a challenge to British naval supremacy.
While America's reluctant intervention in the First World War rescued Britain from defeat, old tensions soon resurfaced.
The U.S. Navy yearned to be as large, if not larger, than the Royal Navy. And what you had then in the 1920s was a ferocious naval rivalry between the two countries, probably the most intense period of Anglo-American hostility in the entire century.
We may have had the ships, but by 1940, rearmament had emptied Britain's bank account. We had no hope unless America entered the war. But a powerful and often anti-British isolationist movement pushed President Franklin Roosevelt into promising to stay out of war. American involvement would come at a painful price: permanent British subservience.
Certainly, one sees the tipping over, the passing of the torch from Great Britain to the United Kingdom at the beginning of the war. There was no doubt who was the great power, and Britain then had to begin to decide how she could help co-opt that power. She had to become America's international best friend, with all that that implied.
I'll never smile again until I smile at you.
For 2 years, Winston Churchill sought vainly to woo Roosevelt and an even more reluctant U.S. Congress into war, or at least giving aid.
But in the capital, the historic bill is passed. A night session sees the Senate vote 60-31 for it.
The March 1941 Land-Lease Act came with a bitter price. In return for 50 museum piece destroyers, Britain had to surrender sovereign territory to the US, a process rich in symbolic humiliation. In an operation still all but unknown, Britain dispatched almost the entire life savings of the British Empire to North America in ultra-secret, increasingly frantic convoys. And she was ordered to have gold bullion worth more than £1 billion in today's prices, ready for collection by the US Navy at Simonstown in South Africa. Professor John Chalmley of the University of East Anglia.
Churchill writes, but he doesn't send this very poignant message saying, but this is like a sheriff distraining on the debts. Well, that's just what it's like. It's the bailiffs coming in and removing everything.
Still, the public mask was one of jolly friendship. In 1941, in an act of powerful and double-edged symbolism, the two leaders arrived aboard majestic warships at a secret summit in Newfoundland, an extraordinarily emotional assembly, not just of the two navies, but of a shared language, history, prayers, and hymns. Here is a rarely heard recording of this extraordinary moment.
Flags flying side by side, Churchill and Roosevelt on the deck at divine service to the same Anglo-American god. And it's the great moment of cousinship, and they all agree on everything. Except, of course, what it leads to is the Atlantic Charter, which is the charter that undermines precisely that British Empire which Churchill had come to power to save.
Churchill was gravely disappointed. America would eventually enter the war after Pearl Harbor. But he hated the fact that the Charter threatened Britain's empire and her naval supremacy. By 1945, the USA had quietly surpassed Britain as a naval power. Now, it was time to dethrone the British Empire economically. The 1944 Bretton Woods meeting of world economists was aimed at designing the world's future financial system. But Ben Steele, of the Council for Foreign Relations in New York, says America's Harry Dexter White, since exposed as a Soviet agent, wanted to cripple Britain economically.
His treasury was determined to use the opportunity by Britain's desperate situation in order to impose conditions on Britain that would make the United States the top dog after the war. in particular, making the pound sterling fully convertible into US dollars at a fixed exchange rate. This was a mortal threat to British solvency after the war.
The Americans took an ideological position that empire was a bad thing and that our empire should be reduced. You cannot expect the special relationship to mean people to give up their national interest.
In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this.
Victory in the Second World War may have left Britain great in spirit, but she was flat broke in fact. Marshall aid, the American grant for the post-war reconstruction of Europe, seemed to favour Britain, but again, America needed her to man the world ramparts, especially in Europe, where America now wanted unity. Here's a surprise for pro-American Eurosceptics.
I had to go outside, actually. I was shaking. I had to go outside and walk around and just collect myself.
Richard Aldrich, Professor of International Security at Warwick University.
My life has been spent in archives in a quarter of a century, and it's physical labour. It's just turning over hundreds and hundreds of boxes in the hope that eventually you'll come across a nugget of gold.
And that golden nugget was some 90 boxes of CIA papers at Washington's Georgetown University, describing a covert operation to fund the European movement, a body promoting European unity with Churchill as its figurehead.
We have bus tickets, we have receipts, we have specific amounts of money attached to particular projects.
These records are the only fully documented example of a CIA covert operation in Europe.
It's fascinating to look at American motivation. It's partly, obviously, about resisting the Soviet Union, but it's also about shaping opinion in Europe to be more pro-American, promoting a Europe that is going to be shaped in America's image, that is federalist, proving that the Americans are fit to be the world leader.
But what's striking about these documents is how expendable they show Britain to be in American eyes.
By the early 1950s, the Americans have realised that the British, although they like the idea of a united Europe, don't like federalism. And so the CIA arranged for the British to be pushed aside. They overturn the Churchill leadership of the European movement, and they put in federalists. To some extent, it's about the decline of Britain as that special partner.
But another event in 1956 would prove to Britain just how unsentimental America really was.
The Suez Canal, never far from the news in its 87 years of history, hits the headlines like a bombshell.
When Britain colluded with France and Israel to attack Egypt and seize back the nationalised Suez Canal, America was actively hostile. Far from endorsing the invasion, Washington forced the British withdrawal by threatening a run on the pound. Britain naturally felt betrayed, but it could have been much worse.
Hello, welcome to the Mudd Library. We hold the papers of John Foster Dulles, which includes oral history.
Long buried in these archives in the attractive old New Jersey college town of Princeton is a reel of tape that should dispel any lingering notions that relations between Britain and America are governed by anything other than hard and realistic calculation.
I believe this is the first time this recording has been played since it was made.
That is essentially correct. It is on a reel-to-reel tape. And it was,
this very scratchy recording relates a conversation between U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the American Chief of Naval Operations in 1956, Admiral Arleigh Burke. Here, Burke is talking about the U.S. Sixth Fleet, which, during the Suez Crisis, was shadowing the British Navy.
So can we play this recording now?
Let me just get things lined up.
And I said, Mr. Secretary, there is only one way to stop them. We can stop them. We can stop them. We will blast the hell out of them.
Blast the hell out of them? That's one of the U.S. Navy's greatest fighting sailors, suggesting that to stop the invasion of Egypt, the American Navy might have to be prepared to open fire on their recent wartime allies.
I gave him orders to go to sea, to be prepared for anything, to have his bombs up, to be prepared for any war eventuality.
I showed the transcript of Admiral Burke's reminiscences to Professor Cholmondeley.
There is no doubt at all that the press in this country did not report it, and they still have not reported it. This is still unknown to most people. Suez is a paradigm of the problem. The British have fooled themselves into assuming that the Americans are on their side and they will do what the British need.
Suez told the world that America had toppled Britain from her imperial throne. What happened next was, according to received wisdom, a rekindling of the wartime love affair. Close personal partnerships, such as Macmillan and Kennedy, Thatcher and Reagan. But I would argue that the post-Suez era was one in which Britain, soothed by various treats and baubles, settled into its new role as sidekick and yes-man. The servant had supplanted the master. The master had become the servant. But what of that famous military intelligence and nuclear cooperation between our two nations? Britain made an irreplaceable contribution to the American atom bomb project, hoping it would keep us as a major world power. But gratitude is clearly not a political emotion. Soon afterwards, Congress forbade the sharing of any nuclear information with any foreign power. For foreign power, read Britain.
All of a sudden, the window slammed shut. Because the Americans made the bomb, essentially they wanted to keep it to themselves.
For all the British bluster about, but you wouldn't have most of these secrets. We wouldn't be where we are now if we hadn't shared our secrets with you. The American attitude is, the agreement's over. We no longer have any need for you. We've actually now been able to incorporate all your physics and all your discoveries into our science. Goodbye.
The British were first surprised and then incandescently angry, outraged.
So much for the beating heart of Anglo-American cooperation.
There goes Sputnik.
Much later, when the Soviets launched their Sputnik satellite, so demonstrating their long-range capability, the Americans sort of relented. Britain's plan for land-based nuclear missiles was obsolete before it had properly begun. The Americans offered to fill our gap with their own Skybolt missiles in return for the use of a Scottish submarine base. Then, bang, the Americans cancelled Skybolt. Too bad for us.
The whole world is making a fuss about a Skybolt that came up to discuss. But you can be sure, definitely, we have the maximum security.
A potentially irreparable rift over this blow was averted largely because of the extraordinary personal closeness between JFK and Britain's ambassador to Washington, David Ormsby Gore, Lord Harlech.
Nassau's gone funky. Nassau's gone so.
Kennedy got in touch with Harlech and said, we're going down to Nassau, you want to come on the plane with me? To the irritation of US bureaucrats, as they thought this was going to be an unfair advantage, as indeed it was.
Sir Christopher Mayer is a former British ambassador to the US.
So Harlech gets on the plane with Kennedy, fly half an hour down to Nassau from Andrews Air Force Base, and he bends the president's ear all the way down about the absolute necessity of our having an independent nuclear deterrent. And it pays off.
That conversation resulted in the Americans offering us Polaris nuclear missiles instead. The special relationship had, it seemed, triumphed.
For in obtaining an agreement for the United Kingdom to acquire what is called the Polaris missile, we get a lasting weapon.
But here's a startling sidelight on America's supposed generosity to its special friend in some astonishing documents uncovered by Dr. Dan Plesh, director of London University's Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy.
The American records show that the Americans offered Polaris to de Gaulle before they offered it to Britain, and de Gaulle turned it down because it would have given up France's independence. And secondly, it was after the Polaris deal that de Gaulle went on French television and said extremely plainly that from now on, Britain will be America's vassal state, America's tool in Europe.
In both the Polaris deal and the subsequent Trident upgrade, the design and maintenance of the missiles were all bought in from America. Not quite the independent nuclear deterrent British politicians boasted of. Dr. Plesch says the American records reveal a stark picture of how far Washington saw us as subservient partners in their own enterprise.
It wasn't so long ago that the head of the American submarine missile program reported as one of his major achievements to Congress getting one of the British submarines back to sea after a refit. There are no independent Trident missiles, what Dennis Healy called rent-a-rocket. It's a part of a common pool. There's Union Jack only ever put on when they're fired for PR purposes.
Whether or not Britain's deterrent is really independent, the bigger question is whether our interests actually coincide in times of real need.
Mr. Speaker, the people of the Falkland Islands, like the people of the United Kingdom, are an island race. Their way of life is British. Their allegiance is to the Crown. They are few in number, but they have the right to determine their own allegiance.
When Argentina invaded the Falklands in 1982, Margaret Thatcher thought she could rely on the supposed bond between her and Ronald Reagan to help win them back. But she was disappointed when initially Washington seemed reluctant to upset its friends in Latin America. Defenders of the alliance, such as Jonathan Powell, are determined to see even this reluctant help as evidence of a special closeness.
They didn't make a big song and dance about it. It was done privately, in public. It looked almost as if they were going against us. But actually, without their help, we would not have been able to achieve the recapture of the Falklands. Much of the advantage we get from the special relationships is hidden.
Hidden and grudging. But that episode was as nothing to what happened when 12 years later Britain was no longer needed as a Cold War ally. The White House could at last respond to the insistent pressure of the Irish-American lobby. In 1994, Bill Clinton undermined decades of British resistance to IRA terror by granting a visa to Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams.
When I heard about the visa going to Gerry Adams, my personal reaction was about the Americans, you bastards, how dare you do such a thing?
Sir Christopher Mayor was press secretary to John Major, Prime Minister at the time.
And when I saw John Major very angry about this, because we had lobbied the Americans not to do this, the State Department had lobbied the White House not to do this, I think the Defense Department had lobbied the White House not to do this. But up on Capitol Hill, there was Senator Edward Kennedy, the late, who basically said to Clinton, we've got to give this man a visa. And when Kennedy spoke, Clinton jumped.
Major refused to take calls from Clinton for 3 days. Clinton tried subsequently to make it up, but the damage was done. Sir Christopher was with Major in Washington during a failed attempt to rekindle the Anglo-American friendship.
We decided to have dinner, and we heard from the White House that the president would join us for coffee and dessert. And we suddenly noticed that all the diners around us didn't look like ordinary people anymore, but had things in their ears or Secret Service personnel. And then Clinton arrived, and he sat on the banquette next to John Major. And throughout the dinner, they very rarely addressed each other, but just sort of spoke to the courtiers around the table. That was when I realized that for all the efforts made by these two to sort of try to be seen to be getting on, it was not a marriage made in heaven.
Britain simply hadn't grasped that Clinton needed Irish-American votes and money more than he needed the UK. I watched this happen, and will never forget the day a senior West Wing aide blurted out to me that the White House viewed Britain much as they viewed Yugoslavia, a place they could mess around in if it suited them. And yet they still expected our support when needed. George W. Bush was not disappointed.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
It really was, I think, 9/11 that helped to bond them.
Jonathan Powell was Tony Blair's close aide at the time.
Well, immediately after 9/11, he came rushing back and he asked me to get George Bush on the phone for him. We finally got him the next day. And at that stage, I remember Bush sounding rather shaken and actually finding it quite useful to have someone he could be pretty frank with, because they had, by that stage, Tony Blair and George Bush built a relationship that allowed them to have a frank conversation.
That relationship had become a personal partnership. The Prime Minister was welcomed at the President's very private Texas ranch, where it's long been suspected, but never proved, that British support for the Iraq War was agreed. The veteran military historian Corelli Barnett, nobody's idea of a left-wing protest merchant, is one of those who condemns that support.
It was this sort of vision of toppling Saddam, the first stage in a democratic revolution which would succeed all over the world. I mean, this is the higher bollocks.
Britain's swift relegation to minor subservient ally did more to undermine the alliance in the eyes of the British public than anything since Suez. Sir Christopher Mayer.
There was a phrase created, total support in public and total candour in private. That was a kind of Blairite motto for handling relations with the Americans. Well, there certainly was total support in public, and there was not enough candour in private.
It's an interesting example, I think, of how the special relationship works.
Jonathan Powell says Blair did restrain Bush.
He rang up Bush, he was trying to engage Bush to go to the UN, and that's what you can do if you have a strong transatlantic relationship. You can have an influence behind the scenes in persuading people to move in a particular direction.
But wait, the Americans didn't go to the UN, so we don't really have influence after all.
We wouldn't have got them into the UN at all if it hadn't been for the special relationship, but we didn't succeed, not really for American reasons, but for other reasons, the French and others who didn't want to go along with this route. We weren't able to persuade them.
Ah, those cheese-eating surrender monkeys, who last year were awarded the new title of oldest ally, when they supported US action in Syria, and we didn't. Professor Kathleen Burke says that over the past century, the special relationship has become a euphemism.
A country says it has a special relationship with another country because it's weaker. Strong countries don't have to say we have a special relationship unless it's flattery. So therefore, you find Gordon Brown streaking through the kitchen trying somehow to find Barack Obama so he can be shown to be standing next to him. Somehow that reflects that Britain has a dependency that is not healthy.
The Anglo-American relationship is very like the worst sort of abusive marriage.
Revisionist historian John Charmley, who casts a cold eye on the Churchill era.
The Americans get from that marriage what they want, but the British power to fool themselves into thinking they're getting something from it is almost infinite.
And so we return to Mildenhall, where as the loudspeakers one by one fall silent, their dying echoes over the flat fields give this tinny recorded music a strange, almost elegiac plangency. Here in Puritan, Cromwellian East Anglia were born the ideas that drove the Pilgrim Fathers to form a power far, far greater than the land that gave them birth. It is rather sweet of them to want to save the Queen and to have forgotten all about our foul footsteps, pollution. And I'm glad they've got their military bases here, especially considering the alternatives. But special relationship? It looks more like a conquest to me.